How you behave says something about you. How you love or do not love, forgive, do not forgive. How you treat one another. How you speak. It reveals something about you. It says something about you. So how you behave says something about you. And our church, we have not always behaved so well. So 14 years ago when I first came on staff, the elders, they said, hey, we're so glad you're here. We want you to get a big, broad context for the church, understand the history. So they gave me this file drawer full of old, church minutes, from old church meetings, thousands of pages. They said, why don't you just read through that, and that'll give you a picture of what's happened. I was like, that's an idea. And so I promptly put that in the category of when I have time, which meant never. I will get to that. But then about a year into being pastor here, I had to find the Articles of Incorporation. I was like, oh, no, papers. So I opened the drawer, and with this deep sigh, I thought, okay, I'm already here. I'm going to go through these. And I got about 2 pages deep, and I was like, oh, now that's interesting. What's this? And I'm like, wait a second, did someone steal church property? Wait a second, the IRS is coming after us. And is he having an affair with her? I mean, page after page, it was just someone shows up to someone's house, they're threatened. The next thing you know, hours have passed, and I'm in this pile of papers reading it like it's some trashy novel. It's full of power struggles, sex scandals, people going to prison, phone taps, threats. If I knew how good it was, I would have saved it for vacation. It'd be great beach reading, you know? Now, I do have just to ease your minds a bit, this is ancient history. If you were to sit down and read the last 20 years of our church minutes, I'm proud to say you would be bored to tears. But here's the thing. We still carry that with us. It's still part of us. So last year I listened to this science podcast, as I'm apt to do, and it was on how viruses can change your DNA. It's bizarre that they can get into your very DNA. And they said if you map out the human genome, which they've done, you will find this kind of all over the place. You'll see that over the generations, death and disease doesn't just affect us, it becomes part of us. In some ways, it makes us who we are. And the body of Christ is like that. We might not be that church anymore, but we still carry it with us. It made us who we are, and so it's understandable when people see us. Well, sometimes that's all they see. So you've probably run into the quote before. There's a couple of them. They're usually attributed to Gandhi, although I'm not sure that Gandhi actually said these things, but it sounds like something Gandhi might say. The first one goes like this. If it weren't for Christians, I would be a Christian. The second one, I like your Christ. I do not like your Christians. Your Christians are so unlike your Christ. Ouch. Now, this isn't completely fair. I mean, I know people in this room and in the church around the world who are very much like Christ. I mean, all the time I encounter people who, to encounter them is to encounter the goodness and the grace and the kindness of Christ. And I experience this almost every day, certainly every week. And yet, it's not completely unfair either. So I am formed by generations of death and disease, and so are you. And I can feel it, and I struggle with it, and I see it, and I am reminded of this almost every day. Just speaking for myself. It's not just our church that hasn't always behaved. I haven't always behaved. So how is it that I can call myself a follower of Jesus for decades now and still have parts of my life that are so unlike Christ? And why is it that after all these years, I still find it hard to forgive, to sacrificially love, to not worry about tomorrow, to just stop thinking about myself and my problems so much? So, recently something happened to our family. Too soon to talk about. But it's enough to say we felt violated. We were violated. And I know, as well as anyone, the teachings of Jesus. I know the way of Jesus. Love your enemies. Bless those who curse you. If someone takes something from you, just let them have it. Be kind to those who are ungrateful and wicked, for that's what your heavenly Father's like. You should be like him. You're children of your heavenly Father. And yet, that's how I want to respond. That's who I want to be in my inmost being. But that wasn't my first response. My first response was insecurity, self-pity, and anger. And not like the godly kind of anger. The kind of anger that destroys things, that destroys people. And that is very unlike Christ. So what's that say about me? So if you've been following along in our study of the life and mission of Jesus through the Gospel of Luke, you shouldn't be too surprised about this, because we spent the last 3 weeks in Luke chapter 5, and in Luke chapter 5 we see that Jesus specifically, explicitly came for those who are broken, unhealthy, those who are sinners. Levi and Peter, they're called sinners. So Jesus came for broken, unhealthy sinners, and that's good news. That's good news. But you shouldn't be too surprised if you collect a bunch of broken, unhealthy sinners to find out that they don't know how to behave. Today, we turn the page to chapter 6, and we immediately begin to feel this tension, though. Because Jesus doesn't just show up to declare his love for broken, sinful people. He says, follow me, imitate me, do what I do, walk the way I walk, become like me. And that is a radically different way of doing life. Like Jesus calls these sinners turned disciples to live without fear, without insecurity, without lust, without greed, without anxiety. Like, how do you do that? How are a bunch of unhealthy, broken people supposed to just live like that? And that's the tension we're going to feel in these two chapters. And that is what I want you to wrestle with today. How are sinners like Levi and Peter, like you and me, supposed to hear these words? Like, what does Jesus want, hope for, expect from us? Like, does he really think we can live like this? That's the question. So our text for today is Luke chapter 6, and I want you to turn there. If you have one of the Pew Bibles, Luke chapter 6. This section is known as the Sermon on the Plain. It's like an abbreviated version of the Sermon on the Mount, and we're just going to take select passages from this, but we're going to do something a little bit different today, because this passage is way more than I can preach. It's way bigger than anything I can give you. In this, Jesus doesn't give us like a little thing. He gives us a vision, this kaleidoscopic, massive vision of what life with God can be like, what we're called to follow him into, what it means to follow him. So some texts, they beg to be preached. Like you come to, it is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. And I'm like, ooh, I'm going to preach that hard. But other texts, I don't think I can preach it. I think I need to get out of the way. I think you need to encounter it. Like you have to wrestle with it. If it doesn't actually get into your life, into your bones, into your conversations, it doesn't matter how hard I preach it. It's meaningless. You have to face it. This text can't be preached. It has to be taught. It has to be engaged. Luke 6 begs to be taught. So I thought, why fight it? Welcome to Bible Study Methods 101, guys. Today we're going to be going the teachings of Jesus, right? In this course, you're going to learn the basics of how to understand and apply the teachings of Jesus. Now, I am personally well aware of the complexities of all the interpretive things that you could do with the text, and I appreciate them all, but at its root, it's quite simple. So this simple method that I'm going to be showing you today is basically the same method I use every single Sunday and every single week in and week out, and it can be described in 3 words, credit to John Stott. Then, always, now. So let's take these one at a time and talk about what we're going to do today. The first word is then. The first question you ask is, what did this text mean back? Yeah, you guys got it already. Look at this. So what did the original author in the original language, in the original context, mean this when writing to the original audience? Now, again, super complex here, but this is where you get into the original language, the culture, the geography, the socio-political context, archaeology. And if you know me, you know I love this. And if you want to talk about this, I could talk about this all day long. But as a lover of this, I have to say it's limited. Because you can be an expert at answering all of those questions, and that might make you a good historian or a good linguist or a good scholar. But that doesn't necessarily make you more like Jesus. So you have to take the next step, and that's when you say, okay, now let's ask the question always. Under the category always, the question is this: is it always true? Is it always true? So that's sure. That's what it meant for that specific time, that specific people. But what does this mean for those who live before or after? And how does this fit into the whole scope of scriptures? And how does this fit into what we know is fundamentally true about reality, God, ourselves? And how does this fit into the teaching of the church across the ages? This is the theological step. Like, where does this fit into the grand narrative of what God is doing across human history and creation? Again, I love this step. If you're good at this, you could be a great thinker or a theologian, and I want to have that conversation too. But it's limited. Because it says almost nothing about your relationship with the one who wrote the text. And this is why we can't be content with historical facts or theological concepts. As foundational and important as they are, we have to take it to the next step, which is now. Now, what does it mean right now? How do we get in on this? How do we get it into our mind and into our bodies, into our habits, into our relationships, and into the way we think and respond to the world without thinking? How do we let the word of Christ dwell in me richly? And this is it. When you go through all of these movements and you get here, this is it. This is the stuff of relationship and application. This is where a hearer of the word becomes a doer of the word. This is where we are transformed by the renewing of our minds. When we've gone through this whole process and allowed it to sink down into our hearts, into our bodies, into our actions, into our behaviors, this is where we learn to think and feel and respond like Jesus. So, couple words before we dive in today. This is going to be interactive, as I mentioned. Let me just say, there's a few of you in here. We call you extroverts. Yeah, today is going to depend on you, okay? So let me say, introverts, it's okay. Introversion, extroversion, different, not right or wrong. So if someone just wants to talk and talk and talk and talk, introverts, that doesn't mean they're shallow. They might love Jesus too. And if introverts, they don't want to say anything, you have permission to just sit and nod and think deep thoughts, but make them happy. Okay? Okay. Good. So let's go through this one example, and then we'll dive into our text for today. Our example is a text that you may or may not know. It's Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 4, and it goes like this. Do not muzzle an ox while it is treading out the grain. So what did this mean back then? Well, let me explain. When you took your wheat harvest, you would then lay it on the ground and have hooked your ox up to a threshing sledge, is what it's called, and you'd run it over that wheat, and it would break apart the grain so that you could extract the grain from the wheat. That's what you did. And this text is saying, when you do that, do not muzzle your ox. Do not muzzle your ox. So what did it mean back then? I think it pretty much means what it says. When that ox is working hard to feed you, the very bread of life, don't starve it out. It's working hard for you. Don't starve it out. Good? Which brings us to the always. Is this always true? Well, if you're using a threshing sledge on your wheat, I guess so. But what about those of us who don't use an ox to break open our grain? Most of us. How many of you have threshed your wheat recently? Huh? Okay. So what does this mean for us? So across time, Jews and then later Christians came to this and said, let's ask some questions about this. Is this just about an ox? Because here's the question. Why does God care so much about an ox? Like, what kind of God cares that much about an ox? And if God cares that much about an ox and it not being starved when it's working hard for you, how much more would God care for a human who's doing work, a human made in the image of God? So they took this verse and they said, well, clearly it does apply to animals. God cares about animals. But clearly it means something bigger. If God cares that much about animals, then he must care even more about us. So treat your laborers with honor. Don't take advantage of those who do work for you, who provide for you the very stuff of life. You get it? All right, so you have a principle, but that means nothing until you get to the next step. So now it's your turn. All right? Now, what does this mean? Right now, I want you to turn to someone next to you, and I want you to discuss, what does this mean? You have 30 seconds. Cue the music, guys. We're going to give you 30 seconds to discuss this, and then I'm going to come back and we'll shout out some answers. Ready? Go. All right, it was only one verse long, so that's all I'm giving you guys. All right, shout out some answers to me. Give it to me. Don't wait, just shout them out. What is this? What is the verse about don't muzzle your ox? How do we apply that, live into that today? Pay your pastor. Wait, everyone stop. Stop. Listen to that man. Pay your pastor, yes. The Apostle Paul will use this verse twice to say, if he's working hard all week to feed you the bread of life, you should pay him. Okay, but what else might this mean? Go ahead. Sorry. Yes, relationships require maintenance. Ooh, I like that. What else?
If someone is working to help you and feed you, feed them back.
Yeah. What else? Don't be rude to those who help you. Any other? Yeah, appreciate the people who work with you and for you.
I was going to say support your farmers where your food is sourced from.
Yeah, support your farmers. That's actually a very practical one. Can I say a practical one? Who cooks food at your house? Are you nice to them? Huh? No? Yeah, okay. All right, so you get the idea. You got it? Okay. Now we're going to dive into some meat here, guys. We're going to go Luke chapter 6, and here's the setup. In Luke chapter 6, starting in verse 12, Jesus goes up the mountain, prays all night long, and then comes down the mountain, selects 12, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 12 to be apostles, and then he's going to preach this big sermon. Now this is a big deal, guys. We're pretty sure that Jesus didn't just select 12 just because he thought like this would be the best for group dynamics. According to Harvard Business Review, it's like 6 to 9, so he got that wrong, or he's doing something else. So we think, it seems to be, that Jesus is intentionally choosing 12 because he is doing something new. He is starting or restarting, as it were, the people of God. This is huge. So in the Old Testament is built upon this one family. Through Jacob, he has 12 sons who become 12 families, who become 12 tribes, 12, the number 12. And then they get lost in slavery, and it's terrible. But then God saves them, and through Moses, he leads them to Mount Sinai. And at the mountain, they enter into a covenant relationship with God. So they are now formally, officially, the people of God. They are saved. They are God's very people. And then Moses goes up the mountain, receives the law of God, and then he comes down and tells them, this is how you, as saved people, as the children of God, you're already saved, but this is now how you live into it, how you flourish, how you fully live into who you're called to be, who you're saved to be. This is how you do it. Here, Jesus, not accidentally, goes up the mountain, meets with God, selects 12 to start this new people of God, and then in the rest of the chapter, he's going to describe for us how we are to live into this new relationship as the people of God. It's not how you get saved. He's already selected them. He's already called them. This is how you live into that. So let's pick it up in Luke chapter 6, starting in verse 20. Looking at his disciples, he said, blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. Blessed are you who hunger now, for you will be satisfied. Blessed are you who weep now, for you will laugh. Blessed are you when people hate you, when they exclude you and insult you and reject your name as evil because of the Son of Man. Rejoice in that day and leap for joy, because great is your reward in heaven, for that is how their ancestors treated the prophets. Now let's ask our three questions. What did this mean back then? Well, the first thing I want to point out linguistically is that the word blessed actually means blessed. Yeah, I know. Now, some want to translate it as like lucky or happy, but in English that tends to make, happy tends to be too subjective, like I feel happy. Lucky tends to be too impersonal, but this is not subjective or impersonal. This is, the language that Jesus uses implies that you are blessed by God. It's not accidental. It's not based on how you feel. He blesses you. And this blessing is for those who are poor, hungry, weeping, and hated. And the original audience, they would have been intimately familiar with these. So if you just do the sociological study, you realize that something like 97, 98% of those who lived in ancient Galilee were what we would call peasant class. They literally lived hand to mouth. There's this study that Sandra Richter, Old Testament scholar, did a few years ago on people living in that culture that reveals that 6 months out of every year, they lived on a caloric deficit, which is to say, 6 months out of the year, their families went to bed hungry. This is crazy. So they know poverty, they know hunger, but on the lips of Jesus, in that crowd, in that culture, poverty is a little bigger than that. Poverty then, similar, not unlike our culture, was associated with shame and dishonor. So people assumed in that culture that if you're poor, well, God must not like you very much. They assume that you're somehow morally or spiritually inferior. You still hear this in our language sometimes. When we talk about someone being morally bankrupt, we use financial terms to describe that. And weeping and hatred, these are people who are like deeply formed by grief, hatred, exclusion. There's a story from civil rights movement, 1960s. Another atrocity had happened, and this kid, this young man, he is angry and he is weeping and he is mad, and he sees this older man who's just standing there stoically. And he says to him, "Why don't you ever cry?" And this big, powerful black man said, "Because if I start crying, I will never stop." The people standing there with Jesus that day, they could relate to that. There are people who are oppressed, they've suffered, they've faced atrocities and slavery. Like all of that is part of their not so distant past. And yet, Jesus says to them, you are blessed by God. You are. So let's take the next step. If Jesus is saying that, is this always true? So, real question here. If you are poor, hungry, weeping, or hated, does that always mean you're blessed by God? No. In fact, if you read the book of Proverbs, you will find many instances of people who are poor, hungry, hated, weeping, because they're foolish, because they're evil. Like there's lots of reasons you could go into that have nothing to do with blessing from God. So what's Jesus up to here? He gives us a couple clues in verse 22 and 23 where he gives us a reason why we might be hated or a reason why we should leap for joy over this. He says, blessed are you when people hate you, and if you scroll down, because of the Son of Man. Because of the Son of Man. Rejoice in that day and leap for joy because great is your reward in heaven. Has something to do with the relationship to the Son of Man, to Jesus, title for himself, and to their belief, their hope in the future kingdom of heaven. So Jesus is talking about a poverty, a hunger, a weeping, a hatred that comes from identifying with him, from following him, from receiving God's blessing, ultimately not based on what this world can offer you. So you're poor because you want something that money can't give you. You hunger for something more than food. You weep because you know that things are not the way they're supposed to be. And you're hated because you refuse to identify with the God of this world. You have pledged your allegiance to a different king and a different kingdom. And if that's true of you, Jesus says, regardless of what it looks like on the outside, you are blessed. Now, I could preach an entire series on this. There's a lot more to tease out here. But I want you to have a go at this. So let's go to the now. How do you and I get in on this? Like, what might it look like for us to be blessed in this way? And what might this say about us for our lives today? So turn to someone, cue the music. I'm going to give you a whole minute on this one, maybe 90 seconds, to process this together and come up with what does it look like to live into this blessing, to seek the blessing that Jesus offers here. Ready, go. All right, let's bring it in. What do you got for me? What does this passage mean for us now today? Just shout it out. Yeah, Jesus is with you. You're expected to suffer. You shouldn't be surprised by it, but Jesus is with you. Yeah. Yeah, be thankful for where you're at. That gratitude, that deep gratitude that comes in this.
Living your spirit and your truth in your beliefs, and then helping others on a one-to-one basis.
It's helping others on a one-to-one basis and living out the truth.
In being judged or being hated, we realize that we can only give grace to others because we've been given such a great grace ourselves.
Mm.
And we can continue to love others because he loves us so much.
So all of this comes from the grace that we've received. This is how God has treated us, so we are able to treat others. That it doesn't respond to the world, but it responds to the grace that we've received. Practically, what does this mean to seek a blessing? Favor with whom? Yeah. So, what does it mean for those of us who are sitting in here who've never been hungry a day in our lives? Most of us have never known real poverty. Most of us do everything we can to avoid weeping. What does this say about the type of blessing we're seeking? Are we seeking the blessing that Jesus wants to give us? Or are we seeking a different kind of blessing? Too convicting. Let's move on. Let's skip to verse 27. But to you who are listening, get this, he says, hey, if you're listening right now, because not everyone is, I say, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who mistreat you. If someone slaps you on one cheek, turn to them the other also. If someone takes your coat, do not withhold your shirt from them. Give to everyone who asks you, and if anyone takes what belongs to you, do not demand it back. Do to others as you would have them do to you. Do to others as you would have them do to you. So, let's go through the process. Back then, what did this mean? Remember, Jesus is speaking to an oppressed, mistreated, slapped around people. And this language is amped up. It's not just the run-of-the-mill abuse that you would find in ancient cultures, but this seems to be a little more severe here. So this is ancient shame-honor culture, and the slapping in particular stands out in this culture. So, in that culture, to slap another man is not so much an act of violence as it is a sign of dishonor, like a way of shaming him. So if you want to kill him, you use a sword. But if you want to destroy a man, you slap him in public. Under normal circumstances, you slap me, and that means I am now under obligation that me or one of my family members has to regain my honor, which means we probably have to come to your house at night with pitchforks and kill you. It's a terrible thing, but that's really how it worked back then. But then, enter the Romans. They've conquered your people, occupied your land. They're this unstoppable military force. And if you give them any reason to think that you might possibly be just delaying or plotting against them, they will not hesitate to crucify you and your entire family. So what do you do when they curse you, when they slap you on the cheek, when they take your tunic from you? Jesus says, you love them, you bless them, you turn the other cheek, you don't demand it back. So for years, I basically just pretended like this Bible verse didn't exist. That whole part about listening, I didn't listen for years. In fact, I remember years ago going to visit my uncle. He lived on this ranch outside of Austin, Texas. So we go down there, he's showing us around his ranch, and he's got like a rifle in his hand. You know, it's awesome. He's got the cowboy hat on, the whole thing. And he was describing this problem he was having with a neighbor, but then he turns to me with like a wink in his eye and says, but here's the great thing. In Texas, you can shoot a man dead if he steps on your property. And at the time, that made sense to me. But then I read this. What do I do with this? So there's very little doubt that Jesus means exactly what he's saying here. Because if you follow the story along, that's exactly what he does. When his enemies come to crucify him, he lets them. He prays, Father, forgive them, and then he lays down his life for them. So it seems that Jesus literally meant to that audience what he said. Now here's the question. If Always. If we take this teaching of Jesus seriously, does this mean that we can never protect ourselves? That we always have to do this? We should always just let others have their way with us? And this is actually a very good question. If you've never actually wrestled with this, you should. Because if you survey Christians down through the ages, many of them would say, yes, that's exactly what it means. We defeat our enemies the same way that Jesus defeated his, by loving them. And if it means we suffer and die like Jesus, that's okay. Because it also means that our life is ultimately in the Father's hands, like Jesus. And the same God that raised Jesus from the dead will someday raise us from the dead, for we are more than conquerors. And this is worth wrestling with. For the first 300 years of Christian history, down through the Christians were pacifist, universally. They taught nonviolence. They practiced loving their enemies. And that is how Christianity ended up overwhelming the Roman Empire, through love. But I would say there are a couple, through even just the rest of the gospel, there are a couple of really important qualifiers here. One is this: Jesus is never, never, never a victim. He's never a victim. So, no one takes my life from me, he says, but I lay it down. He's the good shepherd who lays down his life for his sheep. Jesus doesn't refuse to fight back because he's powerless or helpless or he can't. Jesus refuses to fight back because he did not come to condemn or destroy, but to save and to heal. So he knows revenge, violence, defending your own ego, valuing possessions over people, this will not save. This will not heal. This will only perpetuate a cycle of violence, fear, shame, abuse, oppression. But love casts out fear. It covers over shame. It binds up what's broken. It forgives, reconciles, heals. So like any fearful, insecure, weak person can attack and kill their enemy. But loving your enemy requires a strength that's bigger than your ego. Another important qualifier here is that while Jesus will literally allow himself, he'll lay down all of his work to allow himself to be nailed to a cross, when he sees others who are helpless and poor and being victimized, when he sees others being abused, what does he do? He takes off his belt. He goes in, he starts whipping people, yelling at the top of his lungs and turning over the tables. So whatever this teaching means, it does not mean that we should allow others to be abused. Now, it's your turn to wrestle with this. What does this mean for us? Cue the music, guys. Let them have it. You got a minute. You're on the clock. All right, so give me some practical ways we can apply this today. What does it look like to love your enemies or bless those who curse you or turn the other cheek? Practically, how can we live into this? Forgiveness. Ouch.
My father used to say, just imagine a sign over their head saying, God ain't done with me yet.
You hear him? He said, just imagine a sign over their head. God ain't done with me yet. God's still working in them. God loves them. Oh, don't curse out your boss. Staff, are you listening to him? What does this say about an election cycle? What else? Anything else? Be the better man. What do you think that means?
Don't bring yourself down to lower level.
Yeah. So debasing yourself by meeting them there. The long view, the very long view, yeah, of what God's doing and his faithfulness. And it's his to judge. Yeah. All right, so for the sake of time, we're going to jump into the next piece. And I'll basically just want to give you a picture of where Jesus is headed with this. He says, no good tree bears bad fruit, nor does a bad tree bear good fruit. Each tree is recognized by its own fruit. People do not pick figs from thorn bushes or grapes from briars. A good man brings good things out of the good stored up in his heart, and an evil man brings evil things out of the evil stored up in his heart. For the mouth speaks what the heart is full of. Now, I won't go through all of the steps here because it's pretty obvious. Jesus is saying this is like that. People are like trees. And the type of fruit that you bear, it reveals who you are. That how you behave says something about you. It says something about the kind of person you are. Your actions, responses, behaviors, words, they say something. They reveal something. Not who you say you are, not what other people think about you, but your actions, they reveal something deeply. So if you come home and you explode on your spouse or kids, that's not an oopy-doopy. That actually reveals something about you. If you're alone late at night and you find yourself scrolling porn, that's not an act. It's not, oops. It actually reveals something within you. If your coworker gets a promotion and it stirs envy in you, that says something about your soul. Now, please remember, Jesus is talking to broken, unhealthy sinners here that he loves, that he's called, that he's come after. So he's not shaming them. He's not saying, if you do that thing, then you're unredeemably evil. He came to heal, to redeem, to seek and save the lost. But he does seem to be saying, I'm the great physician. And if I'm going to heal what's broken, you need to know how bad it is. You need to know. You need to be aware of that. And that the goodness that he wants to bring into your life, the love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control, this can only come from a life that is rooted deeply in his love and his grace and a relationship with him. And then he ends the sermon this way. Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and not do what I say? For everyone who comes to me and hears my words and puts them into practice, I will show you what they're like. They're like a man building a house who dug down deep and laid the foundation on rock. And when the flood came, the torrent struck that house, but could not shake it because it was well built. But the one who hears my words and does not put them into practice is like a man who built a house on the ground without a foundation. The moment the torrent struck that house, it collapsed, and its destruction was complete. So Jesus describes two different foundations upon which we can build our lives, and I want you to notice the difference here. It's not what they say they believe. It's not what others think about them. The difference is in one word: practice. So one believes Jesus, of course he does, because he calls him Lord. But then he builds his life on putting Jesus' words into practice. And the other says he believes in Jesus, he calls him Lord too, but he does not put his words into practice. And this is the difference between making it through the storm or having your life utterly collapse. Practice is the difference. So the late philosopher, theologian, thinker, writer, Dallas Willard helpfully describes this as a difference between trying versus training. So if I took you to my house and we go down to the basement to my home gym and I throw 250 pounds on the bar and say, okay, bench that. Now, if you've never worked out before a day in your life and you decide to try and do that, unless you are a genetic freak or the power of God comes upon you like Samson, what's going to happen at that moment is like you're going to like bruise your sternum and bruise your ego. All right? It's not going to work. So you might try it and then be like, I tried it. It's impossible. But then I said, well, come back tomorrow. Maybe let's start at 95 pounds. And then come back the next day and the next day, and we practice, we train. Over time, your body will physiologically change. You will be transformed by the renewing of Paul's gym. And with enough time and some of the right genetics, it's what was once impossible could become impossible. It could become possible for you. I mean, it could be possible even for a little guy like me, guys. It's not impossible. But you can't just try. You have to train. So Willard suggests your soul is like that. When you put the teachings of Jesus into practice, we're transformed by the renewing of our minds, and the things that once felt impossible, blessing those who curse you, becomes easier and easier. Not because the behavior has become any easier, but because you've changed. You've been transformed. And this is why we're spending so much time this fall learning to practice the way of Jesus. Because how you behave, it says something about you. How you treat one another, how you love or do not love, how you forgive or refuse to forgive, how you speak or do not speak. How you behave says something about you. And if you don't like what it says, that's okay. Jesus came for broken, unhealthy sinners. He is not against you. He is for you. He came for you. In fact, he is inviting you to stop trying to solve it on your own and just follow me. My yoke is easy. My burden is light. Follow me. I will show you the way. Trust me. This isn't how you get saved, but this is how you live into the life that I want you to experience, the kingdom life, life with me. And that's the invitation. But you got to stop trying. You got to start training. Father, I pray, Lord, that you would allow these words to burrow themselves into our minds, into our hearts. I pray that this sermon would just be a taste of what is going to roll out this week as we wrestle with your words and we try and practice the words and the teachings of Jesus, Lord, that we are not just a people who hear the words, but we do them, that we obey them so that we can become like him. We want to be like him. Pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.